Well, hey everybody, it's Mr. Schauber, and let's talk about boxing and do our boxing presentation. You know, boxing is also known as pugilism, prize fighting, the sweet science, and pygmatia in Greek. Boxing's been around a long time. In fact, it's probably the oldest sport that we will study in sports history. Uh, Ancient Sumerians boxed in the 3rd millennium BC. Assyrians and Babylonians boxed in the 2nd millennium BC. The Greeks, of course, included it in their original Olympic Games in 688 BC. It stayed on throughout Europe and especially in England, where it became a big sport, and prize fighting has been around in England since the 1500s. American colonists brought it over when they moved here to North America, and boxing, of course, has evolved since then. All sports evolve, and boxing has done that. Boxing used to be bare knuckle, and it was bare knuckle until the late 1800s when gloves were finally introduced. And so, crazy, but boxing, it's kind of the one of the original sports, if you will. All right, now for some of the boxers. You can see I have their height, their reach, the stance they used, where they were from. The reach is determined by your wingspan. That's your reach. And so, just so you know what that means. John L. Sullivan is the first guy we'll talk about because he is probably the first great boxer of the modern era, or certainly one of them. You can see he boxed, turned pro in 1879, retired in 1892. The Boston Strong Boy. His record was 40 wins, 1 loss, 2 draws, and 1 no contest. He won 34 of his fights by knockout. And of course, a lot of sources disagree on his exact record because stats weren't kept quite as reliably back then. But you can see he was 38-0 before his first draw, and he was 40 wins, no losses, and 2 draws before he finally lost in his last pro fight before he retired from the professional ranks. He's recognized as the first heavyweight champ of gloved boxing. He held that title for a decade, and therefore he's kind of the last great champ, heavyweight champ of the bare knuckles boxing under the old rules. And so what's interesting is, especially during the bare knuckles, and then even once gloves are introduced, a lot of fights, there was not necessarily a set round limit for fights. And a lot of fights went 40 or 50, 60 or 70 rounds, uh, and they would go until somebody won. And, basically, or the guys couldn't fight anymore because they were so exhausted. And so you can see, can you imagine going for, 40, 50, 60, 70 rounds? According to some reports, he was the first American athlete to earn over $1 million. So he was kind of the first, one of the original big time athletic stars, big time legends, okay, in American sports. So that is John L. Sullivan. Jack Johnson, big, strong dude, the Galveston Giant from Texas. He 6'2". Okay, turned pro in 1898, officially retired in 1938 at the age of 60. Of course, near the end of his career, he wasn't fighting as much, but 101 total fights in his career. Some of these guys you're going to see fought so much. Uh, you know, Boxers nowadays, they might fight once or twice a year. Some of the big time boxers, because you train for a bunch of months, you negotiate with promoters and with the opponents, and I mean, so if you're doing 2 fights a year now, that's kind of like standard. A lot of these guys were fighting back then a bunch. I mean, they're fighting. Some of these guys are fighting like every month, and 101 total fights, 73 wins, okay, 45 by knockout. He was the first African American heavyweight boxing champ. He held that title for 7 years. He was also the world colored heavyweight champ for 5 years, from 1903 to 1908, before he was the overall heavyweight champ. He was, like I say, the subject of a lot of racial discrimination, a lot of tension. He did not back down. He was not afraid of being discriminated against or being called names. He was controversial. He dated white women in an era when, that just wasn't really accepted, especially in the South. He, was outspoken. Um, he, did a lot of media stuff. As you can see toward the bottom there, he appeared in the press, in radio, in movies, did endorsements for products, kind of like modern day celebrities do. He was involved in the fight of the century, it was called, against James Jeffries, July 4th, 1910, in Nevada. Johnson won and earned, they say, $65,000, which $1.5 million today for the fight. So, but a lot of guys didn't want to fight him. A lot of white guys refused to fight him, not because of his color, but because he was so devastating and so good. So a lot of guys didn't want to fight Jack Johnson. He is definitely one of the all-time legends in boxing. Another all-time legend is Jack Dempsey, the Manasseh Mauler. All right, he is probably next to Babe Ruth and maybe Lou Gehrig. Jack Dempsey is probably the most famous American athlete of the 1920s, the Roaring Twenties. You can see 83 fights, 65 wins, 51 by knockout. He was the heavyweight champ for 7 years. And he had famous bouts with Gene Tunney in Philadelphia, attended by 130,000 people. And that was in 1926. In 1927, the next year, he fought Tunney again in Chicago, attended by over 100,000, listened to on the radio by an estimated 60 million. And so part of it is timing, right? He was a star in the 20s when radio came around, and so all of a sudden his name became a household name, like Babe Ruth, like Lou Gehrig, okay? And so the 1927 fight, particularly interesting with Tunney, because Dempsey knocked Tunney down and stood over him for a few seconds and then finally went to his corner. The rule was if you knock somebody down, you have to go to your corner. Well, Dempsey kind of was confused on where to go and didn't go over to his corner right away. And the ref didn't start counting until Dempsey went to his corner. And then the ref got up to 9. Tunney got up. The fight continued, and Tunney ends up winning the fight. That was called the long count fight. It's one of the most famous boxing matches in history. That fight generated over $2.5 million, okay, in ticket sales, a record that stood for a lot of years. And one of the things I love is look at this picture on the bottom right. What do you notice? Well, he's in his corner with probably, it looks like his trainer, and it's outside. The fight is outside. You can see the hills off in the distance. You can see the crowd there, and you pack 100,000 people right on into a big field to watch a boxing match. It's crazy. It's not like an arena. Okay, today you get these even some of these arenas, and they usually try to do boxing matches today in the more intimate arenas. You get 5-10,000 people maybe, but sometimes a little more. But boxing matches in the old days, they used to do them outside even like this, and how cool is that, right? And so anyway, that's Jack Dempsey. He served in the Coast Guard during World War II, so he was a veteran as well. And of course, he's in the Boxing Hall of Fame on the international level, and the International Boxing Hall of Fame and the World Boxing Hall of Fame. Here is Gene Tunney, Dempsey's opponent in 2 classic fights. The Fighting Marine. All right, you can see he fought from 1915 to 1928. 68 fights, 65 wins, 48 by knockout. He, one of the great fighters of all time, kind of underrated, I think. He fought as a light heavyweight and as a heavyweight. Now, that's something I haven't talked about yet. Most of the boxers we'll look at during this presentation were heavyweights or middleweights. Those are kind of the 2 most, most popular, most famous weight classes. But in boxing, every 7 or 8 pounds is a different weight class, kind of like in wrestling, kind of like in, high school or college wrestling. And so if a boxer gains 7 or 8 pounds, they're in a new classification, a new weight category. And so there's everything, you have featherweight, really light guys, and then you start getting up in, the middleweights and the light heavyweights and the heavyweights. But the most famous boxers are usually the heavyweights, and then kind of in the last 40 or 50 years, the middleweight division became real popular as well. So He fought as a light heavyweight and a heavyweight. Tunney did. He never lost as a heavyweight. He was champ the last 2 years of his career in the heavyweight division before he retired. You can see, like I said, he had the memorable fights against Dempsey. Tunney won both of them. The second bout in 27 was the long count fight. He was the light heavyweight champ as well, and he was in 1922. So and 23. So he was one of the great fighters. Like I say, kind of underrated, I think, because people like Dempsey, and then of course others that would come along. You know, we remember them, but we kind of forget about Gene Tunney, one of the really the great fighters ever. All right, Hammer and Hank Armstrong, Henry Armstrong, man alive, this guy, you would not want to meet him in a back alley. Wasn't a real tall guy, 5'6". His reach wasn't huge, but he was one of the toughest guys certainly to ever fight in the ring. I mean, look at his nicknames: Homicide Hank, Hurricane Hank, Hammer and Hank. 181 total fights from 1931 to 45. So over 14 years, 181. I mean, seriously, it's like he's fighting. I mean, practically, it's like fighting every month. 150 wins, 101 of them by knockout. You can see he fought as a featherweight, a lightweight, welterweight, and middleweight, and he won the title at the featherweight, welterweight, and lightweight divisions, and he held them all concurrently at the same time. He's the only boxer to hold 3 world championships at the same time. And so that's the thing about boxing, is that if you're a let's say a featherweight, and you want to fight up against other opponents who weigh more, you can do that, but you can't fight down divisions. You can't fight down weight classifications. You can only fight up. So this has happened where guys will win a championship at a lower division, and they'll stay at that weight so they can keep their title at that lower division and keep fighting, but they'll fight against guys who are a little heavier than them at higher divisions, higher weight divisions. And if they do well, then good on them, right? So you can see he defended his welterweight title 19 times. I mean, that's amazing. 19 fights as a champ and not losing the belt. He was Ring Magazine's Fighter of the Year in 1937. He is a brawler, no doubt about it. Hank Armstrong. One of the absolute most famous boxers of all time, Joe Louis, the Brown Bomber. Joe Louis is famous not only because he was an amazing boxer, but he was an amazing guy, and he had the timing of it. Again, he had some famous fights, and one of them had implications that were much larger than boxing, and I'll talk about that in a second. You can see 1934 to 1951, a 17-year career, 70 fights, 66 wins, 52 by knockout. He was the heavyweight champ for 12 years. He defeated the Cinderella Man, Jimmy Braddock, in 1937 to win the heavyweight title, and he was victorious in 25 title defenses, which is a record for heavyweights. Unbelievable. I wrote on there, he's kind of often regarded as the first African American to achieve status of a nationwide hero here in the U.S. Now, what made him a nationwide hero? Not only was he a great boxer, but he had some legendary fights against a German by the name of Max Schmeling. In the first fight, Max Schmeling, who was Hitler's pride and joy, and Hitler, of course, believed in the idea of Aryan race superiority, that the light-skinned, German-blooded, German-speaking people were superior to everybody else. And so when Schmeling and Lewis fought for the first time, Schmeling beat him, and it was a shocker. And of course, Hitler was gloating and said, "See, we have superiority." And well, they fought again the second time, and that second fight is considered one of the great sporting events of the 20th century. It was held in Yankee Stadium, over 70,000 people packed in to watch it, and millions of people all over the world listened to it on the radio. Joe Louis knocked out Max Schmeling in the first round, and beat him in that second fight, and became a national hero. and dispelled the Aryan superiority myth. And so uh, he went on to serve in World War II in the Army. The home of the Detroit Red Wings hockey team is called Joe Louis Arena. Of course, Joe Louis is famous also for some of his phrases. He can run, but he can't hide. And another one was, everyone has a plan until they've been hit. Isn't that the truth, right? And four-time Ring Magazine Fighter of the Year. He was the Associated Press Male Athlete of the Year in 1935. And, kind of a cool story, though. He, some bad business deals or in some shady um, things that his, promoters or managers did. Joe Louis basically kind of went almost bankrupt. He was financially really struggling. Um, toward the end of his career and then after. And Max Schmeling, after he lost that second fight against Lewis, went home. He didn't know what was going to happen to him in Germany. He didn't know if Hitler was going to get rid of him or what. But he continued to live, and Hitler didn't get rid of him. But he actually became a very successful businessman in Germany after the war. And he and Lewis had a lot of respect for each other, even though they had been these fierce opponents, and these matches had meant so much. They had a lot of respect for each other. And so Schmeling found out about Lewis's hard financial situation, and he helped him out, and they became really pretty good friends for the rest of their life. And so that's a pretty cool story that a lot of people don't know. But um, yeah, Joe Louis, absolutely one of the toughest, fiercest competitors in the ring that we've ever seen, and one of the great fighters. Sugar Ray Robinson. Uh, You can see he turned pro in 1940 at the age of 19. He retired in 1965 officially. 200 total fights, 173 wins, and 108 by knockout. He was 85-0 as an amateur with 69 knockouts, 40 of them in the first round. And then he said, I probably should turn pro. And yeah, probably. From 1943 to 1951, he had a 91 fight unbeaten streak. He didn't lose for 8 years. And you can see he held titles at the welterweight and middleweight divisions. The welterweight title for 5 years, and then moved up to middleweight. And he held the middleweight title 5 different times. First boxer in history to win a world title in the same division 5 times. So he won and then lost it and then won it back, and lost it and won it back, so forth. But he held it 5 times. A lot of people consider him to perhaps be the greatest pound for pound fighter in the history of boxing. Twice the Ring Magazine Fighter of the Year, and those awards were almost a decade apart. So he had staying power. Sugar Ray Robinson was fantastic for many, many years. He had a couple of classic, many classic fights, right? But a couple of them against Carmen Basilio and Gene Fulmer, who we'll talk about here. He's kind of the originator of the sports entourage. All right, when he comes out of the dressing room, he's got his trainer, and he's got maybe his promoter, and he's got his buddies, and he's got this guy and that guy. That was Sugar Ray Robinson. He was the entourage guy. So, but yeah, he was just unbelievable. Can you imagine being that guy in the upper right there, taking that left uppercut from him? So, one of the greats, no doubt. Speaking of great, Rocky Marciano, the Brockton blockbuster, the Rock from Brockton, the Rock from Brockton, Massachusetts. He was the pride and joy of that town of Brockton, Massachusetts. He turned pro in 47, retired in 1955. So basically an 8-year career. And in those 8 years, you're going to see what he did. Unbelievable. He was the inspiration for the name, the iconography, and the fighting style of Rocky Balboa from the Rocky movies. When Sylvester Stallone wrote the Rocky movies, and he had to call his main character something, and he called him Rocky, and that was after Rocky Marciano. Rocky Marciano was 49-0 when he retired, 43 wins by knockout. He was the world heavyweight champ there, you can see, for 4 years, from 1952, 3.5 really, 1952 to 1956. He defended his title 6 times, beat some great fighters to keep his title, and he's the only person to hold the heavyweight title and go untied and undefeated throughout his career. 3-time Ring Magazine Fighter of the Year, and his punch was described this way. He definitely was one of the hardest punchers we've ever seen. Uh, his punch was described as Marciano's knockout blow packs more explosive energy than an armor-piercing bullet and represents as much energy as would be required to spot lift 1,000 pounds 1 foot off the ground. So you can imagine being hit by one of his fierce right hands. He just was devastating. After he retired, of course, he was a living legend, but he died in a plane crash in 1969 at the age of 45. His 46th birthday was the next day. So that was a tragedy, obviously. But he was absolutely one of the great fighters, one of the hardest hitters, hardest punchers in the history of boxing. And here are some pictures, more pictures of Rocky Marciano. Just a brute, just tough. He just had that. He had the it factor that that some of these athletes do, and man, he was awesome. But yeah, he's the inspiration for the Rocky movie. So every time you watch a Rocky movie, think of Rocky Marciano. All right, Gene Fulmer. Gene Fulmer was just a brawler. He'd stand toe to toe and just brawl with guys, and he was great. And my dad talks about watching Gene Fulmer when my dad was a kid, and he thought he was just fantastic. Gene Fulmer is from West Jordan, Utah, right here in Utah, real close to home. Nicknamed the Cyclone. He had a career that spanned a dozen years, 64 fights, 55 wins, 24 of them by knockout. He was managed for a lot of years by his mentor, Marv Jensen. And he won the middleweight championship in January of 1957 by upsetting Sugar Ray Robinson. It was a huge upset. And Fulmer beat him, and people started to realize how great Fulmer was. Now, Fulmer lost the middleweight title back to Sugar Ray Robinson later that year, but then he regained the middleweight title in August of 1959 and held it for 3 years. So, like I said, he had great fights against guys like Carmen Basilio and Sugar Ray Robinson. He went 2 wins and 1 loss and 1 draw against Robinson, and nobody did that really. Sugar Ray Robinson is considered, like I said, by some people to be the greatest pound for pound fighter ever. And so Fulmer not only stood toe to toe with him, but beat him twice. So Gene Fulmer, absolutely. Sometimes I think it's overlooked in this category, but he is, he's a middleweight just stud, and he was fantastic. He's one of the great middleweight fighters of all time. Well, he's got to be the most famous boxer of all time and one of the most famous athletes of all time, Muhammad Ali. Muhammad Ali, you can see 6'3", big guy, 80-inch reach. His reach was huge. Okay, that was a big advantage that he had over most of his opponents, is that he just had the reach advantage, and he used it so efficiently, so well. Born Cassius Clay Jr. in Louisville, Kentucky, he was nicknamed the Greatest and the Louisville Lip because, like I say here, he was outspoken, he was controversial, he was entertaining. He always had a poem or some kind of a rhyme to give you. He never shied away from an interview. He loved the microphone, and he would say controversial things. But he also was charming in a lot of ways, and he he was endearing to a lot of people, especially the black community who looked at him as kind of one of their heroes. He was absolutely one of the great fighters of all time. It wasn't just optics with him. It wasn't just the hype. He could back it up. You can see 61 fights, 56 wins, 37 by knockout. He won the heavyweight championship at age 22 in 1964. And shortly after he won the title, he joined the Nation of Islam, changed his name to Muhammad Ali. In 1967, during the Vietnam War, he refused to go into the U.S. military, citing his religious beliefs and his opposition to the war. And because of that, he was arrested and he was found guilty of draft evasion, and he was stripped of his boxing title. He was stripped of his heavyweight belt. And he didn't fight again for almost 4 years. In fact, the U.S. Supreme Court overturned his conviction in 1971, and that's when he got back into boxing. He was out of boxing for 4 years, and some people thought he might never box again. But after that Supreme Court decision, he got back into boxing, And not only did he get back into boxing, he won the title back just a few years later. So you can see he's the only three-time lineal world heavyweight champ. He won the title in 64, 74, and then 78. Some of his legendary fights with Sonny Liston, whom he beat to win his first heavyweight belt in 1964. Joe Frazier, who we'll talk about, he went 2-1 against Frazier, and then George Foreman, we'll talk about as well. He beat George Foreman in their only fight. Now, I say on here, the 1974 fight with Foreman was called the Rumble in the Jungle. It was in Zaire, Africa. One thing Muhammad Ali was famous for, because the hype was so big surrounding him. I mean, he became a living legend, and he, like I say, loved the spotlight. So his fights, a lot of them had nicknames. They had these. The buildup was just so huge for his fights. So he beat Foreman to win the title back in 1974, and he started using his strategy called the rope-a-dope to beat Foreman. Foreman wanted to just stand toe to toe and just outpunch Ali, and so what Ali did is, he's a little older by this time and stuff, so he tried to outsmart Foreman, and he got up against the ropes, and he would absorb a lot of Foreman's body blows, which did some damage, and of course, a few headshots here and there, but he let George Foreman basically punch himself out. Foreman got tired, and Foreman could never knock Ali out. Ali blocked a lot and absorbed a lot, and so Foreman just got tired, and then Ali knocked him out. And Ali used that rope-a-dope tactic a lot toward the end of his career, and by the end of his career, it really had done some, a serious number on him, on Ali's body and brain. He took a lot of punishment, and you could see it, but that was a very effective tactic for him to use when he wasn't quite as quick and as fast as he was as a youngster. As a youngster, for a guy that was 6'3", man, his feet were lightning quick, his hands were lightning quick. He was amazing. His third bout with Joe Frazier was called the Thrilla in Manila. It was the year after the fight with Foreman. That was in the Philippines there in Manila, 1975. And both fighters just brawled and brawled and brawled. And really neither of them was ever the same after that. But they sure put on a show when Ali fought Frazier those three times and fought Foreman and other greats. They put on a show. He was 5-time Ring Magazine Fighter of the Year, and of course, like I said, he's famous for his quotes: "Float like a butterfly, sting like a bee. Your hands can't hit what your eyes can't see." Okay. He had also won a gold medal as an amateur in the 1960 Olympics, and Sports Illustrated called him the sportsman of the century for the 1900s. Muhammad Ali, all-time legend. There he is as a young guy there in the upper left. There he is in the upper right. I am the greatest. I said that even before I knew I was. Yeah, he never shy, never lacked a good quote, did he? There he is in the bottom right, evading a roundhouse by Joe Frazier. Crazy, huh? And of course, that upper left was a common scene, right? Just in front of the microphone, just going to town. There's in the middle there an advertisement for the Foreman fight. The Rumble in the Jungle, and there's the butterfly and the bee on the upper right. There he is in the bottom left, one of the most famous sports pictures of all time, knocking out Sonny Liston to win the heavyweight championship at the age of 22 in 1964, and then he and Joe Frazier posing for a classic shot there. So Muhammad Ali, still one of the most famous athletes ever, no doubt. And one of Muhammad Ali's great opponents was Joe Frazier, Smoking Joe. Turned pro in 1965, retired in 76, and then came back for a stint and officially retired again in 1981. 37 fights, 32 of them wins, 27 by knockout. Joe Frazier was just a brawler. He toe to toe, wanted to just street fight you, okay? And Frazier was tough, and he was gritty, and he was fun to watch. He was the world heavyweight champ in 1970. and he defeated Muhammad Ali in the fight of the century in 1971, their first fight to defend that title after Muhammad Ali came back um, into boxing uh, after his suspension was revoked. He lost the title, Frazier did, in 1973 to George Foreman in Jamaica, and then he lost his last two fights against Ali in classics. Okay, New York City in 1974, and of course the Thrilla in Manila in 1975. He only, like I said, he only lost 4 fights his whole career, and 2 of them were to Ali and 2 of them were to Foreman. So that's not too shabby, right? Nothing to hang your head about losing to those guys. Of course, like I said, he also beat Ali once as well. He relied on bobbing and weaving his relentless pressure to wear down his opponents. He was a powerful puncher, powerful left hook, 3-time Ring Magazine Fighter of the Year. He'd won a gold medal in the Olympics in 1964 as an amateur before his professional career started. And so, yeah, Joe Frazier, if you ever get to watch some highlights of Frazier, definitely well worth your time. He was entertaining. He put on a show when he boxed, no doubt, and he just wanted to stand toe to toe and uh, and just brawl. So, and that's kind of what people want to see, right? So he did it. He entertained, no doubt. George Foreman. George Foreman is one of the greatest personalities in the history of boxing. One of the great stories in the history of boxing. And you can see big guy, 6'3", 82-inch reach. He turned pro in 1969 and had an 8-year career, retired in 1977. And then he came back, had a comeback almost 20 years later, and fought again. And I'll talk about that in just a second. Pretty amazing, his story. So Big George is his nickname. 81 fights, 76 wins, 68 by knockout. He was one of the hardest punchers probably in the history of boxing. He was just a brute in the ring. He was a 2-time heavyweight champ, 1973 and 1994. 21 years between winning the titles. Of course, he had famous bouts against Joe Frazier, and that's who he won the heavyweight title from in 1973. He fought Ali in the Rumble in the Jungle in Africa and lost that bout and lost the title in 1974. In 1994, at the age of 45, he made a comeback and became the oldest heavyweight champ in history. He won the title back in 1994. He's twice been the Ring Magazine Fighter of the Year, and he won an Olympic gold medal in 1968 as an amateur. And just a crazy story, right? Who wins a heavyweight championship as a young guy and then retires, comes back at the age of 45 and wins the heavyweight championship again? Um, he is, for all of his accolades in boxing, he perhaps is as famous for his George Foreman grill as he is for his boxing career. Um, his George Foreman grill was something that came around, must have been, I don't know, late 90s, early 2000s. He sold a ton of those. And one of the craziest things about George Foreman, he has 5 sons, and they're all named George. George Jr., George the third, the fourth, the fifth, and the sixth. Kind of crazy. So George Foreman, what a character. Marvin Hagler, marvelous Marvin Hagler, a middleweight who is one of the great middleweights of all time. Ferocious in the ring, just a tough guy. You can see southpaw stance. So he was left-handed, and his career was about a decade and a half long. Of his 67 fights, 62 wins, 52 by knockout. He was the middleweight champ for 7 years. He had legendary fights against the likes of Roberto Duran and Thomas Hearns, Sugar Ray Leonard. Uh, his fight against Hearns in 1985, which was just an absolute brawl, was called The War, okay, was the fight of the year for Ring Magazine. And then his bout against Leonard in 87, the super fight, was also the fight of the year. That decision was very controversial. It went the distance, and Leonard won on points. But a lot of people thought that Hagler could have and should have probably won that fight. So he was Boxing Illustrated's Fighter of the Decade for the 1980s. That's how good he was. Um, he was tough, like I said. I wrote on there he had one of the best chins in boxing history. I mean, he could take a punch and not go down. He was just he was a brute in the ring. He was great, and definitely one of the great middleweights of all time. Sugar Ray Leonard is also one of the great personalities of all time in boxing. Uh, Always had the smile on his face. He was the media darling. They loved interviews with Sugar Ray. Um, he was charismatic and likable, and he was an excellent boxer. You can see his career went 20 years. I mean, he was it was really about just a decade and a half, and then he kind of had a couple fights late, in the 90s. But you can see 40 fights, 36 wins, 25 by knockout. He won world championships in 5 different weight divisions: the welterweight, light middleweight, super middleweight, and light heavyweight divisions, which is incredible. Um, he also won a Boxer of the Decade for the 1980s award, and twice the Fighter of the Year for Ring Magazine. He was Sports Illustrated Sportsman of the Year in 1981. Um, First boxer to earn more than $100 million for his fights. Now, it's during this era, in the late 70s, but especially into the 80s, early 80s, mid 80s, that um, some boxing matches became pay per view. And so if you wanted to watch, you had to pay for it, and it'd be like $50, right? It was expensive, and that was from probably the mid '80s to the well, to even now. But you get 10 friends, and they each pitch in $5, and you got your pay per view covered. So that people started doing that, and the money just went out of control. It was just crazy. So over $100 million in his career in purses. He had been an Olympian, won a gold medal as a light welterweight in 1976, and of course his classic fights against the likes of Roberto Duran and Thomas Hearns and Marvin Hagler. But Sugar Ray Leonard, one of the greats, no doubt. Evander Holyfield, the real deal. Evander Holyfield was awesome. Big guy, 6'2", just chiseled, built. Um, You can see 57 total fights, 44 wins, 29 by knockout. He was the cruiserweight champion at 200 pounds for a couple years. Then he moved up to heavyweight, and he was a 4-time world heavyweight champ. He won it, lost it, won it back, lost it, won it back, lost it, won it back. Only 4-time champ in history. Uh, Great fights against the likes of Riddick Bowe, Mike Tyson, George Foreman. Okay, he was fantastic. Uh, 3-time Ring Magazine Fighter of the Year, and his he just Holyfield was always in tip-top shape, probably maybe the best shape of anybody in the boxing world, and he was just a toe-to-toe brawler, and his stamina was fantastic. He was just awesome to watch. Everybody was hoping for the Mike Tyson Evander Holyfield fight for the championship when Tyson was champ, and uh, and and we'll get to Tyson in a second. But Tyson just uh, unexpectedly lost to a no-namer, Buster Douglas, and then Evander Holyfield won the title from Douglas. So Holyfield never did get to fight Tyson in their primes. It was only a few years later that they fought, and they were well, especially Tyson was past his prime. But yeah, it was just awesome to watch Holyfield because he'd stand toe to toe and just punch, and he was fantastic. He was awesome. Here is Iron Mike Tyson. Mike Tyson, when I was growing up, was the ticket. He was kind of the guy to watch. Um, Holyfield, who we just got done talking about, was just as great of a boxer, maybe better, but Mike Tyson just had this aura around him. He had this mystique around him. not a big guy, 5'10", and not a huge reach, 71-inch reach, but he was the ultimate toe-to-toe, just beast, brawler, whatever you want to call him. He wanted to knock guys out in the first round, and he often did. He wanted to just obliterate his opponents. He'd come into the ring, walk down toward the ring. He'd have just his black shorts, you know, no robe usually, just shirtless, and his black socks and his black boots, his boxing shoes. And he just, oh man, he was just like the guy to watch. He just had this thing about him. You could not miss a Tyson fight. So, um, interesting childhood, rough childhood in New York, and he got found by a boxing uh, trainer, and they said, "Hey kid, let's make a boxer out of you. You're a street fighter. Let's make a boxer out of you." And they did. You can see, uh, 58 fights, 50 wins, 44 by knockout. He won his first 19 fights by knockout, and 12 of them in the first round. He won the heavyweight championship when he was only 20 years and 4 months old, and that was the youngest in history. He was, you can see, he held the WBA, WBC, and IBF heavyweight championships. Those are three different belts, and he held them all. First boxer to simultaneously hold them all, and he held them for 2.5 years. Twice the Ring Magazine Fighter of the Year. His famous bouts with Holyfield, Buster Douglas, Lennox Lewis. Earned over $300 million in his career, and just, shady promoter, bad spending habits. He basically went bankrupt, if you can believe that. And he was the first to admit that, he didn't know how to spend money. He was young, he'd never had money, and he would just buy stuff and buy more stuff and waste money. Famous story of his is he had a Rolls Royce. These cars, these British cars, I don't know, $250,000, and he had a driver, and they were driving along, and the Rolls Royce ran out of gas. And so he just said, "Oh, pull over," and the driver thought, okay, well, we'll just go get some gas somewhere, and you know, and Mike Tyson said, "Nope, leave the keys in it, leave. Let's walk away. This thing's no good to me anymore. It has no gas in it. We're out of here." And so they left the Rolls Royce by the side of the road and never went back for it. I guess somebody just had to put some gas in, and they'd have a Rolls Royce, if you can believe that. Because his mentality was, well, it ran out of gas. It's no good. I just buy another one. Who cares, right? And so, um, kind of crazy. It's unfathomable, in ways to think about in terms like that. But that was Mike Tyson. He'd be a fascinating interview for sure. He's an enigmatic character. Probably, in the boxing ring, it was just a can't miss TV. Of course, in his bout against Evander Holyfield, second bout, he famously bit part of Holyfield's ear off when they were locked up at one point. I mean, just crazy. Uh, but man, he was something to watch. So yeah, watch old Mike Tyson highlights, and I mean that's what people want to see when they watch boxing. It's just toe to toe, just throwing punches, and it was, he never backed down. It was incredible. All right, Manny Pacquiao, the Filipino, left-handed, small little guy, 5'7", 67-inch reach. Um, his career went from 1995 technically until 2019. He was, for all intents and purposes, way past his prime uh, by the 2010s, really. But you can see what I mean. He was great. Um, First and only boxer to be 8 division world champ. Wow, can you believe that? 62 wins, 7 losses, 39 by knockout. Uh, So he fought in all, like I said, all these different weight divisions. He won the championship in 8 different divisions: flyweight, super bantamweight, featherweight, super featherweight, lightweight, light welterweight, welterweight, light middleweight. I mean, just amazing. Um, 3-time fighter of the year and fighter of the decade by different outlets for the 2000s. So yeah, he was lightning fast with his hands, his feet. He would just brawl with you as well. He was fun to watch. So That is Manny Pacquiao. And finally, Floyd Mayweather. Floyd Mayweather has um, gone down in history for his unblemished record. Incredible, right? Uh, Nicknamed Pretty Boy, Money, and TBE, the best ever. 50 fights, 50 wins, no losses, 27 knockouts. You can see he's held titles in different divisions from super featherweight, lightweight, light welterweight, welterweight, and light middleweight. So 5 different divisions. Great fights, of course, over the years. Floyd Mayweather is more of a dodge and weave and lock up and wait for his perfect moment to get that perfect punch in and try to knock the guy out. So he is exciting to watch. At times, he's a little more methodical than some of the brawlers that we've looked at, but 50-0, incredible. I mean, nobody's done that. So uh, doesn't get any better than that, right? And 5-time ESPY Best Fighter Award, and just incredible, right? I mean, who doesn't want to go out on top? And Mayweather did that. So there's our boxing presentation. Hope you enjoyed it, and watch some of the highlights of these guys. They are really amazing.